smallpox, and other lethal infections were caused even the most smallest of a little cut on your foot when you went to the beach of death sentence. This is a world that we have worked very, very hard to escape from. It is a world that we've spent immense amounts of money, international cooperation, and endless amounts of work hours into providing cures and making them affordable to everyone. In this case, we bring to you a new plague that threatens us. It is that of antibiotic-resistant bacteria that threatens to make even the smallest of diseases, which you might sneeze or cough at, into one that you will never, ever recover back from. Our model has two parts, the negative and the positive. And we'll bring to you how, one, the harms of this form of drug use and how we solve them, and two, how we have a principled right to trade off the harms that we find from art. First, under the model, we will examine compliance to these policies by one, is the government of that state controlling the supply of these high resistance likelihood antibiotics, like H antibiotics in this case of the debate, let's simplify it. Are they controlling the supply to people who are actually trained and licensed and know how to use them? Second, are you providing good oversight mechanisms so that people, when they do use them, are keeping track of continuing to use them in the proper manner? Third, do you have a national health code that sufficiently educates and informs people in that country on how to use them and what to expect from their doctors when they're prescribed this medicine? Enforcement mechanisms to ensure they do follow this national health code. And finally, the WHO will frequently evaluate these countries on whether or not they're adhering to these codes so that it stays go for in the long run. The positive in our model is one in which we maximize and utilize all possible assets that we have available, all hands on deck, to maximize education about the better alternative of broad spectrum antibiotics, which do not have the harms of in this case. And second, we'll do everything in our power to make economically accessible the use of these broad spectrum antibiotics in the places that otherwise wouldn't be able to afford their use and would resort to cheaper antibiotics like H antibiotics, the bad ones. We'd rather have economic subsidies and things to maximize education and access to these things in this case, right? Now, moving on to the harms of use and how we solve for them. Understand that the form of use looks like, for example, on a minor infection, you use the harshest drug you have available, the H drug, right? In this case, for even minor infections, and you overuse them on a daily basis, that leads to them evolving resistance to these drugs. When these bacteria grow, like this, they increase the level of deaths and improve and make even normal medical procedures extremely dangerous to carry out. It means they don't just affect people with infection, they affect people who are undergoing other forms of medical treatment, that they're at risk of being infected, and that means every hospital has to take higher abiotic precautions and makes the cost of giving healthcare to all actors in this debate significantly higher. Second, it means that these resistant bacteria can be cured. That's the definition of resistance, right? It means you throw the drugs you have at them, but they just shrug it off like it's no big deal. The point with this is that when you have bacteria that can't be cured, that's sentencing someone to death. They can do nothing but hospice care for them and wait for them to die. And the third impact of this is that this eats up a huge amount of research efforts. More than half of research efforts in the medical sector right now are geared towards producing broad-spectrum antibacteria and fighting antibiotic resistance. This essentially means it comes at the cost of curing diseases that otherwise we should be focusing on the cures on, right? This means things like Alzheimer's, things like tuberculosis don't get the same amount of effort and treatment because we're wasting our time solving something that is essentially man-made crisis. When we waste our time on solving problems and fighting for the solutions and problems we've created ourselves by the improper use of the drugs that we have, we are taking it away from those who desperately need it the most. For example, in developing countries where we need to improvise, make existing drugs cheaper, for example, this is exactly the sort of case where it falls at the expense of this. Now, what do we do and the impacts of this on this? One, we educate the people to best make access to this healthcare. Why it's going to be effective? We've seen that, for example, that health, and this is important, health is a uniquely rallying cry for people regardless of their ethnic backgrounds, regardless of political affiliations. The health and well-being of your people and of your country is the most universal political system that you can make an appeal towards. This means that even in places that are highly divided or highly hard to access, feasibility makers are the most rural parts of India, they have still reached them through things like vaccination and education campaigns, have still reached even the furthest and most remote villages of India because of the huge benefits of doing so. This proves that the motivation and the capacity does exist, and feasibility is not the problem on our side of the house. The second impact, not taken, is one where we make it economically accessible and viable, right? So this on two ways. One in which we make the direct use of these drugs more accessible because WHO makes it cheaper. And second, we make the ability for research to make these drugs cheaper to produce, cheaper to store, cheaper to use in this case, more likely when you're no longer wasting huge amounts of your potential on making sure these work. Now, on the third basis, we'll take you in a sec. On the third basis, we stop non-state actors before that closing.
How many people in the US use their antibiotics for a full term and don't just stop after a few weeks when they feel better?
So I don't see how that's like relevant in this debate, because if they don't meet the criteria, then they're going to be facing like the sanctions, facing like the harms. Sorry, just say sanctions a lot. They're just facing the harms of like not obeying these guidelines, right? So this applies regardless of which country you choose to come from. Stop non-state actors, and this is crucial in this debate, because often it's not their fault that they're using these in their agricultural sector to make pesticide use. Often it's like multinational corporations with significantly more sway and capital in these developing countries who flout these rules and regulations and use them on their crops, making things worse for everyone. In our world, they have to fight an international convention that makes them illegal, right? This, compared to fighting developing countries' state, which they can easily buy off and easily pressure. It is thus way easier on our level to stop non-state actors from using these in the first place. Finally, let's look at the worst case, right? Let's imagine this has like huge amounts of harms, we don't have a right to do this, or whatever they might come and show. Two things. You have a right to self-defense, both as a medical community and as the global community. You have a right to ensure your future generations have a world to inherit that is safe for them to inhabit, and you have a right to prevent these from happening. And second, you have, as being said, on principle, we already accept in this world, for example, the overriding benefit of world saving over like protecting anything else. Right? The right to quarantine is respected in all countries, where you take away the freedoms, like every freedom imaginable for a person, as long as you can prevent the harms to a greater number of people from spreading that disease. Right? So we already accept in the medical system where we want to prevent mass harms in this case. The impact of this is where we are very happy to trade off, and we have existingly having the trade off any sort of harms that we want to show from up, because we agree on our side from OG that the system of value that you must show is the one that is most consistent with the norms and rules of the medical field as a whole. That is, preventing major crises gives them and authorizes them to use more means than any necessary, that authorizes them to overcompensate to ensure that the worst demons of the past can be exercised for good. We are very proud from OG to report.
Dear panel, don't be fooled by the government's extremely soft case that they have talked about pushing for education, pushing for funding for replacement drugs and that kind of thing. The opposition is also all for these kind of soft educational or funding initiatives. What is at question in this debate is that whether or not we're going to cut millions of people in the developing world off their life-sustaining drugs, off the supply of the drugs that's saving their lives and keeping them from the serious complications and even death, or cut the agricultural sector of the essential drugs that saves their harvest or keeps their harvest from plague and keeps them from food crisis. That is the core of this debate. I'm going to offer you in my constructive why there are socio-economic reasons for this antibiotic use in the developing world and why we cannot just simply cut it off. And second, how cutting it off will strengthen the dominance of Western pharmaceutical companies and essentially give them a free monopoly or oligopoly that will only push them up drug prices and make them less accessible to the developing world. But before I move on, just one factual rebuttal to OG. They say that the abuse in the agricultural sector of these drugs are pushed by multinational corporations. We don't think that's true because we believe it is pushed by local socioeconomic realities. Because what is the real incentive to multinational corporations or these pharmaceuticals is to sell them the more advanced, the more expensive replacement drugs as possible. They don't want them to use the cheap alternatives, the cheap alternative antibiotics. That claim that multinational corporations have an active incentive to push for antibiotics is simply not true. Let's move on to this. Let's move on to our first constructive. Why there are structural socioeconomic reasons for the use of strong antibiotics in the developing world? That's very simple because they are cheap and effective in treating deadly diseases and agricultural disasters. Or they have all these antibiotics has been around for hundreds of years, and they are all their formula like in open domain, so there's no patent patents, and it can be easily and very cheaply mass-produced within these developing countries and make it very accessible to anyone who needs them. Like a batch of antibiotics in China costs less than $0.5 US. And what happens is that under the Gulf case, says that the alternative is going to be much more expensive because all these innovative replacement drugs that Gulf wants to talk about, they are rather more recent innovations. Most of them tend to be still within patent protection and within the exclusive control of Western pharmaceuticals. That means the developing world has to pay excessive shipping and intellectual property, all this kind of cost associated with importing these drugs from this developed world. And although we know that OG wants to say subsidy, but the United States cannot even fix its own drug price problem. We don't think the developed world has any capacity to give any kind of subsidy that OG fantasized for. Let's move on to what are the consequences of this sudden drug hike. First of all, in terms of agriculture, the peasants that uses antibiotics, they use them in very large quantities. They use them in tons, if not like kilograms, and whole large quantities. And they use them against epidemics or plagues that could take their entire year of harvest. And once you cut them off from that, you do not make, and the alternative is so expensive that they cannot afford it, that could potentially wipe out the entire year of harvest for the peasants and cause a massive amount of food crisis, mass starvation, and desperation within large segments of the developing world that could eventually lead not just to starvation itself, but conflicts, political and tribal and religious conflicts within this kind of thing by the heightened economic and political tension. And the second is that simply people, the current patients who rely on these drugs cannot afford them. This will very straightforwardly lead to either loss of life or further complications that could be treated in a more timely manner. That's true. You are making their diseases more chronic and loss of productivity, loss of quality of life. That is, we do not want that. And that makes this point. And the last one is that it is extremely expensive to retrain all the doctors and medical students for their new guidelines or for their new use of drugs. For example, all these doctors take years of medical schools to get familiar with all these kind of drugs and how to use them and their complications and their side effects and how to manage them. And also a lot of these doctors are not that easily retrainable because they tend to reside in rural areas that does not have really internet access or access to the professional like associations or communities in the urban areas or in the developed world. It will take an extremely long and confusing process to retrain these doctors, and there could be a lot of problems in between that doctors don't know how to do, doctors misusing all these kind of drugs. And just the whole project of retraining is extreme sudden retraining within their short frame of time. It's just such a costly public project that we do not want to undertake in a short frame of time. We are fine with education, we are fine with more application, but we don't think this cutoff is the best solution because this whole transition takes a long time. And before I move on, okay, I'll take closing if you have any.
Sure. Would you rather a system where small outbreaks break out, but they are not immune to drugs, so we can stop them from being pandemics, or one on your side of the house where drug-resistant bacteria can wipe out an entire nation's crop supply?
We know we are weighing different different consequences, but what we are telling you from opening opposition is that the immediate cutoff that the government want to propose is already going to cause immediate harm in terms of like unable to be transition, unable to afford, and unable to access. We believe they are already causing as bad a crisis as they try to set out to prevent. Let's move on. What will happen in their world? What will happen if people do not have access to cheap alternatives? Because we believe that the cheap, effective antibiotic alternatives will still be available. These formulas are out there, and factories and pharmaceuticals within developing world will continue to manufacture them. And they are going to be manufactured within national borders, so they're not really going to cross any national borders. The WHO cannot stop that from happening. And what instead will happen is that poor people who cannot afford alternatives will still buy into the cheaper antibiotics. And the bad thing is now people are pushed out of the public health care system because the public health care system in the developing countries are forced by the WHO to comply to these drugs, to not administer the cheap alternatives to the patients. So the patients, if they want to get access or if they want to use the cheap alternatives, they have to actually leave the public hospital, go to like more sketchy clinics, or go back to their own home and try to treat their diseases out of a certified doctor. And we believe that will cause tremendous harm in and of itself, and that will cause a general mistrust in the developing world of the public healthcare system, that the system is only for the rich, that the system is only for other residents, or whatever, and reduce the general political support for more funding, for better public health initiatives, or for public health reformation that they want to push forward in the very first place. And my second speaker is going to continue talking about how this will strengthen the dominance of Western pharmaceuticals and the political backlashes of this. Proud to close.
Does something really crucial in this debate that opening up ignores. We tell you the necessity of the ban and how you can never have that with pure education, because if that was the case, people wouldn't be dying of these diseases that currently exist in the status quo, right? So two things in the speech. Firstly, some like outward refutation to opening up, and then we'll build on the case, right? So let's get into opening up. What do they say? The first thing they tell you is this, like, a large part of their case panel recognized lies on the premise that, look, it's too expensive, we can't do this, because these developing nations are the ones that are hurt, these developing nations are the ones that cannot provide these medications. Three responses here. The first thing is the subsidy, right? They seem to misunderstand how the subsidy is going to work. Warish outlines it very, very clearly in his speech, but we tell you that, like, if the US has failed, that's not a reason as to why the WHO fails. That's a very different organization. You have international funding. They don't seem to understand that. We tell you the subsidies will work. We think at the point at which they can allow the sale, they can definitely allow the subsidization that works with it. Here's the other reason why that will work, because now the WHO is spending a lot less fighting these outward problems that arise out of these resistant drugs, right? Because currently they're fighting in countries like Sri Lanka. They're trying to fight to get rid of these resistant drugs. Now they can use that money in order to subsidize the drugs that we do want. We tell you that's the mechanism as to why that will work. But then let's talk about this problem, because I think this is a principally fucked up problem here, right? Because they tell you there's a right to, because they completely disregard Warish's right to self-defense point, right? Because they tell you, well, look, the developing world won't be able to afford this better medication that won't kill millions of people, hence we ought not fund it. Now that seems pretty fucked up to me, because these developing nations are probably the ones that, if there's a massive pandemic, will not be able to fight it. Hence we think we would much rather prioritize the fact that they now aren't dying as soon as they get a cut on their foot because they took like an antibiotic resistant medication, right? We tell you that yes, if it costs maybe $2 more, we think the WHO should prioritize spending more money there, trying to implement the good kinds of medication, because these developing nations are the ones that are probably going to be the most affected by this pandemic. It's a moral principle clash here. They do not engage with the constructive that comes out of Warish's speech. But then let's talk about the extension that Warish gives you here, and I'm going to expand a bit about it, and why this is true, right? I'm going to tell you why this holds non-state actors accountable, right? Because let's look at the characterization. In the status quo, the nations that aren't able to comply with the WHO guidelines aren't purely doing it because doctors want to make more profit off this anti-resistant drugs, right? They're doing it, we think, that they're doing it in a large amount of cases. It's these developing nations who aren't able to hold these non-state actors accountable, right? Because of their sorts of the agricultural misuse that occurs. So what does this look like? This looks like Monsanto openly adopting pesticides and agricultural products which cause high-resistant problems to the millions of Bangladeshi and Nepali working-class individuals who consume and work around these products that come out of this, right? What's the issue? Why can't Bangladesh, Nepal, all these other nations currently hold them accountable? 3 reasons, right? The first reason is because these international corporations are far more powerful than the state themselves, right? This is the sort of corruption or the forces that Warish tells you in his speech. But secondly, we think that they simply just don't care about the alternative, right? They don't have a reason to. But the third reason, this is really, really important because this clashes a lot with the opening up case, right? Because they tell you, well, look, now what happens is that these monopolization of these corporations. Here's why that's not going to happen, right? Because Monsanto in Nepal currently, the biggest agricultural product they're using is Syndicate, which is financed by the WHO. Recognize that a lot of these corporations that they talk about care about profit, and the cheapest way to get these agricultural drugs is through WHO, who sells them at the lowest price possible. We tell you, when you take away and you make it illegal to sell these very drugs, we think it means that Monsanto now starts thinking about the fucking products they use when they try and implement these in the agricultural sense. It forces them to be compliant. This takes away a large part of the opening up case when they tell you, aha, well look, monopolies, you're going to get monopolies. Throwing around that word doesn't mean anything if you cannot impact that. We tell you that when you take away the cheapest viable reason how they can use these drug policies, they're far more likely to be comparative, right? Let's weigh this out. What do you get on their side of the house? You get these corporations now who are being forced to reconsider and who are more likely to use the cheaper products that the WHO will subsidize, which are the very good kinds of drugs that Warish talks to you about, right? This is how we get actual, meaningful, practical, pragmatic change that we get on opening government uniquely. Let's go back to Warish's case, because we don't think that they actually do a lot of engagement here, right? Because the first thing he tells you is the harms of the status quo and how we solve those uniquely, right? He tells you about the resistance and the further pandemic that occurs, right? He tells you, this is important, because this is logically precedent to any other argument that's going to come in this round about how people are going to suffer from massive pandemics. Warish gives you the initial, the principled case here, and the practicals, about how there's a moral right to self-defense, where we have worked for eons and centuries, and especially the WHO, who strives, its biggest goal is to eradicate these pandemics. They've worked for years in order to not become regressive. We tell you, side opposition is doing exactly that when they open it up to the possibility, or the likelihood, of these drugs leading to small things. And now this means that if I do consume these, these drugs, or I take these antibiotics, it means that now I simply need a cut on my foot to go back to the 14th century. We tell you that's incredibly regressive, and it does everything to counter the goals of the WHO, the goals of the right to self-defense by the pharmaceutical sector, by the thing. I'll take a POF. Anybody here on off has one? Okay. Now let's deal a little bit with the closing opposition, right? Because they say, aha, but look, the U.S., right? There's people in the U.S. Here's the initial problem with the POF. I think the extension is going to rely largely about developed nations, right? Here's the problem with developed nations. We think, A, developed nations probably are also being coerced by the very individuals that I uniquely brought to you, right? These large corporations. We tell you that now these corporations have a far greater incentive to fall into line because their cheapest option, which is the cheapest WHO drug, is being eliminated and made illegal. We think, if anything, that probably impacts more at a developed nation level than a developing nation level, right? So recognize that their argument also falls on this logical precedent argument that corporations or non-state actors now must buy in, right? Look, at the end of the day, panel, we must prioritize what the goals of this round are, right? And A has to be that we need to line up with the goals of the WHO and the right to have self-defense to a lot of these diseases and pandemics that we want to stop. We give you that in opening government. But largely, we tell you how non-state actors are now forced to do that simply because of the way these corporations work. Things like profit incentives. When you take away the least viable, or the most profitable option, they're far less likely to be coercive to these very states that I guess the entire op bench wants to protect. We do that, hence, very, very proud to propose.
I would like to ask you that stage. I would like to invite
So I think it's easy for us because many of us probably do come from Western or developed countries that do have decent public healthcare or private healthcare systems. To imagine a world in which this policy is easily enforceable and something you can easily comply with. The reality for a lot of countries that you're talking about in this debate is that you simply cannot suddenly force them secondly, I'm going to talk about why this policy doesn't work. And secondly, and thirdly, why even if it does work to the extent that they wanted to, the massive human costs you impose are unjustifiable. Okay, so first thing about antibiotic resistance, right? Let's look at the main cause of antibiotic resistance, because OG says that it's primarily due to the overprescription and the overuse of really harsh drugs to treat minor illnesses. We say that one of the probably the main cause of antibiotic resistance is that people just simply don't take all the pills that they are prescribed within a certain time limit and save them for next time, right? Because in a lot of places it's really difficult to access antibiotics, or just they cost a lot and there are economic reasons that they have to do this, right? This policy, either in countries that can't immediately comply with this policy, means that people have to get more expensive alternative treatments, which means people are more likely to engage in this sort of behavior, which is and these alternative treatments also just aren't possible in a lot of cases. But secondly, they're also more likely to continue accessing these drugs under the table, as ASA tells you, because there are existing supply chains and there are existing markets within these. And since there's obviously a large amount of demand in countries that now cannot legally access these sorts of antibiotics, that means that there's demand for these drugs to be available anyways, because presumably people don't want to die, right? That means that black market prices, for example, are a lot likely to be higher than what you would get under a normal healthcare system. This means that this behavior, which is driven out of financial necessity, doesn't actually change in the long term, right? This is something people do out of economic necessity. Thirdly, we say the demands of lots of semi-private healthcare systems is what actually causes overprescription in the first place. If they want to fix the idea or fix the problem of the overuse of really harsh drugs, then they have to fix literally the entire healthcare systems of places like the United States, in which chronic overprescription of antibiotics is driven by consumers demanding these sorts of things from their doctors, who are unlikely to change those financial incentives just due to their policy. Okay, so let's talk about why this policy doesn't work. Firstly, I think ASA does a really good job of telling you all the reasons in which a lot of countries cannot comply with this sort of policy. He gives you the example of when a lot of developing nations as well, the price makes this sort of enforcement really prohibitive, right? These drugs can generally be mass produced. So even with this sort of policy, the patents for alternative treatments are still likely to be in control of Western pharmaceutical companies, rendering the price of these alternative treatments unviable for a lot of people. So the response we get to this from the opening government is that a lot of developing nations do this simply because this is the only way we can hold non-state actors accountable. They give you the example of Monsanto here. So first of all, if states are so subservient, anyways, it's unclear why you would be more successful under this policy, because accountability only works if this sort of policy is effective. Secondly, we see this just simply cements the power of Western pharmaceutical companies, right? This is what ASA starts getting to, and it's what I'm going to expand on now. Because first of all, cheap antibiotics, which don't have patents, are easy to produce. When it gets more expensive, that means that it's more expensive if these sorts of things are patented, and these are generally produced by Western pharmaceutical companies like GSK or Johnson & Johnson. The WHO effectively gives Western pharmaceutical companies, therefore, a monopoly to charge ridiculous prices at the point at which other nations cannot access cheaper antibiotics that don't have these sorts of cases left, because they are the only alternative that remains. This is likely to continue, therefore, it's likely that these large companies are will continue coercing states. Look, government has to take this burden, because if you can subsidize to the same level as current prices, then a ban would obviously be unnecessary, right? The government needs to show, therefore, why their probabilistic future of drug resistance outweighs the certain and immediate harm to millions of people who depend on antibiotics, and also to millions of people that depend on antibiotics for agricultural reasons. You're not in response to the whole you don't get a monopoly idea. The WHO can and does fund research under the status quo, but it has no legal power over the pricing of drugs. That's why you're still likely to get monopolistic prices at the point at which the WHO literally creates the conditions in which that can occur. Okay. Furthermore, ASA also talking about why retraining doctors in these regions is especially hard, and we don't get a response to that on OG. But thirdly, we say that even in a lot of developed nations, some just we can't comply with the whole overprescription idea of antibiotics, because that's inherent to the nature of a semi-private or private system that primarily relies on consumer demand. Just due to the profit motive that exists in the US, you're unlikely to get any sort of change. But secondly, it also tells you why you get a general mistrust of public healthcare organizations, right? The people who are least likely to be able to access expensive alternative treatments during the time that these sanctions are applied are most likely to either live in rural areas or most likely to be under financial duress. Therefore, these are the populations that generally have the least amount of political capital. This means that people can get alternatives to go abroad, etc. Whereas the people that are most affected by this policy have the least ability to impact any sort of political change to change the mechanisms within these countries. Lastly, why it's bad, even if this does work, because OJ says that it's the right of the medical community and to protect future generations, etc. We see this argument is entirely contingent on the successful alternative of this policy actually preventing antibiotic resistance.
money as something as wacky sounding as injecting dead germs into yourself to protect yourself. This isn't a feasibility debate because that's a cop-out.
No, it's a feasibility debate. That's why you're imposing sanctions on developing nations and which a lot of other countries in order to do this sort of thing. Like, I just don't understand how you can make this a purely principled argument just because feasibility is inconvenient for you. So let's talk about human cost, right? First of all, ASA tells you that, there are so many complications to not immediately getting treated with antibiotics, right? Like, even if this policy is successful, taking them at their best, there's going to be a time lag during which antibiotics are not widely available to people that need them the most. This means that, especially for a lot of STIs, for example, immediately being treated with antibiotics is really important so you don't develop future complications, like, for example, to immune disease. But secondly, we hear no response to that from opening. But secondly, we see that, you are likely to get, massive social costs and, massive economic harm, so, famine, right? Because, A, a lot of antibiotics are used when it comes to agriculture, right? Or the alternative is you just get worse pesticides being used, or you just get, the spread of disease among livestock. We think that's very likely within the communities that we're referring to, because they're the ones that don't really have access to the expensive alternative treatments that they are talking about, right? It's the best case scenario, right? Even if this policy is successful, you still get a massive human cost imposed. It's unsure if that's worse than the potential future cost that they're talking about, especially because they don't actually prove that this is the policy that's going to solve antibiotic resistance, and especially because they are unsure of how long it'll actually take to get the kind of political change we're talking about within these countries to change healthcare regulations and to comply with WHO regulations. At the end of the day, panel, we think this is A, a policy that isn't going to work because it isn't a feasible reality for a lot of countries, but B, even if it does work, you get massive social pressures, you get massive social harm to the people that we want to help you most. Very proud to oppose.
I would like to have a few last speech, and I'd like to invite the member from Senator
I think so far this debate has lacked an analysis of why exactly it's the case that large-scale pharmaceutical companies, for instance, continue acquiescing to this type of demand, and to why governments haven't been able to step in to prioritize these types of things in the past. We think it's simply the case that the profit incentives that exist inside of the status quo mean that it is never the case that that the problem of drug resistance diseases, especially among individuals, is prioritized by governments because it simply never comes up due to the fact that demand continues in the status quo. What we want to bring you on side closing government are two things. First, we want to talk about why this actually solves the problem of issue prioritization inside of the status quo and pushes governments towards compliance. And second, we want to add an analysis of what compliance actually looks like inside of the status quo, and why we think that type of compliance is the only thing that can lead us to both more sustainable policies inside of human healthcare and more sustainable policies in agricultural care. First, some quick responses to the stuff that gets added in the DLO speech that we just heard. First, she says, actually, this isn't going to solve any of the issues of drug-resistant bacteria because, people don't take all their pills, right? Recognize that this is just mitigation, and the problem of people taking all their pills is not an issue in creating drug-resistant bacteria, but rather is an issue in people just getting the same disease a second time. We think in most cases the issue is the overprescription of new, recently researched antibiotics and allowing drugs to be disease to be exposed to them for the first time. If you're just getting your penicillin and you're not finishing your unit, these types of penicillin has already most diseases have already developed some kind of resistance to this, so it's not very important. Next, they say there's a huge incentive. Actually, I'll respond to that in a second point. Last thing they talk about is why we think that this cements the power of pharmaceutical companies. But recognize, insofar as pharmaceutical companies operate in Western liberal democracies, there's a large incentive in the status quo, inside of rich Western liberal democracies. It isn't the case that developing countries have to be the ones that place these bans. It is the case that developed countries are the ones that place these bans. So a lot of the weaknesses in government they talk about aren't actual importance. First, I want to talk about, in extension, why we think this solves the problem of issue prioritization in the status quo. Recognize that the market responds to demand that is relatively consistent in the status quo, but doesn't have an incentive to recognize whether or not this demand is justified. we think, on our side of the house, we solve this problem because governments don't have an incentive to invest themselves due to a wide-scale collective action problem where the costs for each individual government would be overwhelmingly high compared to the small chance of benefits that they would receive. Our side of the house, we solve this collective action problem by actually tying government action to a large prize that they want to hold on to. Why is it the case that governments are now significantly more likely to actually adhere to these types of things? The new analysis we want to add is why there's a massive incentive for governments to actually hold on to these things. What is so important to governments about staying inside of the World Health Organization and making sure they don't face sanctions from the organization? First is that we think in Western liberal democracies or richer governments in general, wherever they be across the world, these governments have a huge incentive because the research capacity that the WHO bequeaths upon them is hugely important, right? Recognize that most new drugs are created by modifying previous drugs, and the entire body of epidemiological research that the World Health Organization grants to governments is only available due to their membership, which we think means that large-scale governments will large, wealthier governments will highly prioritize adhering to these regulations. So when they talk about being able to access drugs onto the table or MNCs going unregulated, this is really silly because governments like the United States have invested a massive amount in epidemiological research that is highly dependent on them not facing these types of sanctions. Looking towards the developing world, we think it's highly likely that they do put all efforts that they possibly can into emphasizing these types of things. These World Health Organization workers coming to their aid in cases where there are epidemics, as well as the preventive investment that the World Health Organization makes in creating preemptive treatment is highly important inside of these countries, and the regulation of these types of these companies, again, isn't going to be particularly expensive because most of the burden, insofar as these countries also operate in rich countries, can be carried out by those richer governments. That's why we solve this initial collective action problem. The second piece of extension I want to bring you, though, is not only why we solve the collective action problem by pushing these burdens on each individual countries, but why, rather, we are able to rebalance the scales in the status quo towards wealthier countries actually doing their burden. Recognize that a lot of the characterization we get from the opening opposition team is pretty disingenuous. It isn't the case that individuals in developing countries are actually spending massive amounts on these types of drugs because they're not always that expensive. Because oftentimes, particularly among subsistence farmers, they can't be affording these types of things because it is developed countries themselves that are operating in these areas when it comes to multinational corporations. What happens in the status quo is that rich countries are overusing these drugs, and poor countries are the ones that possibly face the burden if a wide-scale epidemic breaks out, because they can't stand up to the, or they can't stand up they can't do the types of wide-scale quarantining efforts that actually happen. So what happens on our side of the house? A lot of the analysis we actually get from OO can be really easily co-opted in our side of the case. Insofar as, for instance, wealthier countries are wide-scale food importers, the fact that the cost of agricultural production across the board might go up a little bit just means that the costs on consumers in the first world are going to go up. Individuals are going to have to pay more due to these types of irresponsibilities from the international community. First opening?
Yes. You have to take the burden of accessibility, because if we can make price low, then everyone will choose to have the replacement drugs, and the ban will be totally unnecessary. Okay, so insofar as prices go up across the board, we think it's the case that it gets burdened onto consumers instead, because the only reason that it would be harder to produce is if other companies or other agricultural producers undercut you, but this isn't happening. Everybody is facing the same prices. So what does this mean? What are the types of things we see with compliance? First is we're going to see more responsible agricultural policies from Western liberal democracies. We're going to see more investment into GMOs like golden rice, which saved 100 million people's lives, because these are the types of investments that mean you don't need to rely upon antibiotics. We're going to see a shift away from expensive allocations, like over-allocation on things like wheat, and more diversification of crops to avoid the type of opening up to bacterial infections. And last is we're going to see more focus on preventative healthcare resources, like preventing livestock exposure for farm workers in developing countries. More emphasis on preemptive antibacterials, which is the only way to actually stop pandemic in the long run. Redistributing and diversifying crops, investing in these types of GMOs, and actually preventing the type of risky behavior that causes bacterial infections in the first place is the only way we actually make progress on our side of the house, and it's through the rebalancing of the scale.
I would like to ask you that, and I would like to come out of this position, which is
government maybe do okay is explain why the WHO may have some power over developing countries. What has been massively overestimated in this debate is the power that the WHO has over countries like the United States, who are the people who are actually going to be selling these drugs to the developed world. It's not enough for opening governments to say, well, this debate is about a principle sort of problem. They actually need to show that the solution has some level of efficacy if they are going to succeed in this debate. I think that when the WHO is funded largely by countries like the USA, who benefit from selling antibiotics to the developing world, I think when the USA is increasingly in an age of moving away from prescriptive international organizations, they've actually got to show why the USA will listen to the WHO and not just ignore these guidelines. 2 points that we're going to bring you from closing. Firstly, why countries still get access and why this access is worse, importantly moving above our opening, and secondly, the backlash you get against the WHO within these countries, assuming this policy works is a big assumption. Before that, let's just deal with this bullshit principle they get, right? Because the principle they give us is this idea that, it's the idea that antibiotics resistance is so bad that, it justifies anything to, actually get. Notice if we prove outside the house that we get better dealing with antibiotic resistance, we co-opt this principle and we're in this debate is not about that. Okay. Why do these countries still get access to these drugs? 2 ways. Other countries like the US still continue to sell. Why is the US going to still continue to sell? Because there is a massive profit incentive for them and their companies within them for being able to for having access to these markets. For example, the Argentinian beef industry allows the US to sell calves to at a young age, allows them to be raised there, pumping them with antibiotics to make sure that they don't die, etc., and then buy them back at a massive cost. Note at a lower cost, right? Notice how strong the agricultural lobby is within the United States. Look at how many subsidies there are for agriculture within the United States. The US government is unlikely to comply with this, to the point to which the agricultural lobby tells them not to. What happens when the US doesn't comply with it? The WHO can either sanction the US, in which case I think you're likely to have a situation in the US attempt to withdraw from the WHO, or at least cut the funding of the WHO, thereby not allowing them to give all the massive subsidies they want to give on their side of the house, or the WHO just ignores this. Notice this is increasingly in a world in which the US does not respect international laws and does not comply with these things. That's the best case for them. The worst case is it's countries who don't currently comply with the WHO under status quo, or who are not in the WHO under status quo, who are not bound by these regulations and by these bans, right? We think they continue to sell. Secondly, black market and companies, because even if countries follow the WHO, illegal production can still continue. The WHO has literally no power over these organizations. Just notice the WHO is not really a global policeman. They do not have the global infrastructure in order to enforce this ban. I think we have to have a lot more work from opening government rather than just saying how bad this situation is going to be. Why do countries just continue to access these drugs instead of complying? In the first instance, I'd say it's just very easy to continue accessing these drugs. Comparatively, it's incredibly hard to comply. We asked in a POI, something to the effect of, would the US be affected by this motion, given that the majority of people don't actually follow the antibiotic trial fully? And the answer we got seemed to be yes. So the burden that they are placing on people, on doctors, etc., is that patients will need to use their antibiotics for the full term in order to comply with this and that kind of thing. Why is it very, very hard to get the change that they want to have? Why is it likely that doctors are still going to continue prescribing antibiotics wrongly on their side of the house? Firstly, patient pressure, right? If you are a doctor who has got to see 100 people in one day, it is highly likely that you're going to cave to patient pressure when they're just like, give me antibiotics, give me antibiotics, give me antibiotics. To give them those antibiotics, you can move on to the next person because it's so much easier for them fighting back against that. Notice there is also not the government infrastructure in order to regulate every one of these individual doctors to make sure they're complying. Secondly, when you don't have access to better kinds of treatments, it is so much easier to just shove antibiotics in someone's face. We think on our side of the house, we'll talk about how the WHO is more likely to have good treatments on our side of the house, you are much more likely to get this from us. Secondly, we'd say there are often strong lobbies within these countries who rely on these drugs, right? Things like the agricultural lobby within countries like Argentina, right? They're much stronger and therefore much more likely to pressure the government and pressure companies in order to continue to have these drugs coming into these countries. Before I tell you why that's worse than status quo and not just the same as status quo, which is what opening opposition say. Opening.
All it took for HIV to ravage the world was one initial patient. Even with perfect education on your side of the house, abuse is still possible. The only way to overcome compensate by the ban on the initial sale, and they show no better solution than the one we bring to the
Right,
table.
getting onto that later, we'll show solutions we co-opt that principle. Like, just don't listen to this massive rhetoric, like, it doesn't actually do any analytical work in this debate. Okay, why is it worth, importantly, moving above our opening opposition? We did say you are more likely to get stronger drugs on outside the house. Why? Because if you pump your beef with a stronger antibiotic, it's likely to grow even bigger, which is in the profit incentive. Notice that when they are under WHO guidelines currently, you are likely to get some level of compliance with them. But secondly, they're less safe, right? Because we say these producers currently listen to demand, right? At the point at which there is demand for these goods, they are likely to have them with no regulation whatsoever, making these drugs less safe on their side of the house. But thirdly, we say you can't trace them, right? At the moment, if some resistance does emerge, and it does seem like some resistance is likely to emerge on both sides of the house, at the point at which the WHO knows what is being sold where, it is much more likely that you're going to be able to track these outbreaks and prevent these outbreaks better on our side of the house. You can't do that in the black market. Second point, why do you have backlash against the WHO? So this is assuming that policy works, right? Two reasons. Firstly, we say within developing countries, antibiotics are often seen as a magic fix, right? Take this pill and you will get better, especially for people without that much education. The WHO takes away this magic fix and condemns you to death at the point at which you can't get this, right? There's a massive reason to hate this organization. Secondly, we say political will within the country, right? To the point at which we prove it's really hard to comply with this, right? It's much harder for a government to just blame the Western organization who is not allowing you to have, the antibiotics and actually changing anything on the ground. That works for electoral incentives because they continue to get elected to the point at which they're just able to blame someone else for the problem. Why is this bad? It's just so much harder for the WHO to help people at this stage. Notice this in a world where there is currently already a mistrust of Western medicine and Western doctors. At the point at which you demonize the Western organizations even more, they are even less likely to help. Even less likely to be receptive of help. This means they are less receptive to education than the WHO might be able to do. The doctors are less likely to accept help. But importantly, in situations of crises, like the Ebola outbreak, we think it's incredibly important that you have a World Health Organization which is trusted and can therefore respond to that crisis in an appropriate way. At the point at which the WHO is seen as a savior within these countries, when they give you the magic fix, you are much more likely to listen to everything else the WHO wants to say. Very proud to oppose.
So in this speech, I'm going to do two things. First of all, I'm going to talk about why this is justified and why the intervention of the WHO is the only possible solution that exists on either side of the house. And second of all, I'm going to explain the mechanisms by which we actually gain the solvency that actually ties us to. First of all, on the principle, we think when people die as a result of this policy, it's not the WHO that kills them, right? It's the negligence of their governments. Even if OO's arguments about these socioeconomically rooted barriers to compliance are true, these are reasons why they aren't completely blameworthy for not complying. These aren't reasons why they aren't just culpable for their harm. They get passed down to future generations and more numbers of people, necessarily because the harms of being infected by a resistant strain are totally irreversible, as opposed to small pockets of pandemics, which we can later contain once the government actually acquiesces to the reasonable demands of the WHO. Second of all, though, the moral dilemma they paint, where, for example, like thousands of people die of a preventable disease, only actually happens if governments have some sort of reason to refuse to comply, despite the havoc being wreaked on their own citizens, right? What reason do they actually give you for governments being so ham-fisted by allowing thousands of other people to die just because they don't want to educate their doctors? What did Jack explain to you that solved for this? We told you that the cause of non-compliance in the status quo is due to deprioritization, that is, in both in the developed and developing world, it is so easy for us to push off the cost because we ourselves don't bear the cost of being infected with a resistant strain, right? It's not a lack of you get more oversight of major multinational corporations rooted in countries like Europe, rooted in countries like the US and Europe, which currently tend to abuse this. On our side of the house, we think, if anything, there is a better balancing of harms to ensure that developing countries which gain access to these drugs later don't actually only gain them once resistance has already been identified. Great. Second of all, though, why we actually think the WHO intervention is crucial and they're the only actor. Recognize that the market only responds to demand, but can never question whether or not that demand is grounded in good justification or whether it's based on nefarious incentives, right? This is the reason why there has to be a third party that intervenes to say, hey, even if there is demand for really strong dose, we can't allow this to happen. Why do we think the WHO is actually going to have the standing to make this happen? Because as Jack explains to you, it's not the case, as they seem to assume, that the WHO is going to either ignore it or just give them a slap on the wrist. I'm not going to speak for OG, but certainly on CG, we're willing to stand for much stronger sanctions, and also just the risk of the loss of membership if they don't comply, right? I don't think it's the case that we have to defend the weakest form of implementation. Second of all, though, as a corollary to this argument, Jack explains to you why no government would ever risk losing the massive benefits that come with the WHO. Why is this true? Because when you are part of the WHO, you don't just gain nominal benefits to membership, you actually gain directly material ones. That is, first of all, you gain access to the massive research apparatus, a ton of well-trained epidemiologists, and just a whole ton of funding. Second of all, you gain the ability to have people mobilize really quickly in response to epidemics that tend to overwhelm the local government. But finally, just because the WHO provides a ton of other things just beyond antibiotics, right? The WHO actually provides you, provides things that affect people globally, like distribution of malaria nets, distribution of polio, things of that sort. And those are also reasons why the backlash they talk about never happened, because the WHO already has so much goodwill to gain from literally doing things like fucking eradicating smallpox for the entire population, right? So on their side of the house, the best case scenario is that major multinational corporations are slightly disgruntled, but it's not the case that there is a total loss of confidence, which is the reason why the WHO actually has the ability to make sure this is effective. Great. So second of all, I want to talk about how we think this actually plays out. I think there's two parts to this debate. First of all, how this affects infectious diseases of the human variety. Second of all, how this affects agriculture. Before I go further, I would love to take a thing.
Even the U.S. government cannot control their pharma industry. Why do you think the WHO can have the power to do that when none of their member states do?
Oh, yeah, so the reason why the government doesn't do it isn't because they have no ability to, right? It's because they have no incentive to, right? There's no harm to allowing agricultural practices that are harmful to go on, especially since the U.S. government might gain certain benefits from it. On our side of the house, when there is a really high, when there is a much greater cost to allowing agricultural practices to go on unchecked, that's the reason why the U.S. government will now mobilize the political capital it already has to crack down. Great. So with that said, I want to talk first of all on how this affects infectious diseases of the human variety. So basically, I think actually, I'm going to talk about the general. I'm going to talk about more of the general infrastructure-based ones to respond to CO first. So their argument is basically, first of all, that countries will continue to sell this. So first of all, based on what we've proposed, we think they would have to leave the WHO in order to actually break the ban openly. We're totally okay with threatening to keep them out. Second of all, I think the other argument is just a lot of patients exert pressure on their doctors, right? So it doesn't matter whether or not they exert pressure, because the point is they wouldn't be able to access it, right? So on our side of the house, what we're saying is even if the patients demand this, the option becomes either they go to the black market, which the vast majority of people are unwilling to do, just because there is a huge risk of safety hazards. When someone's not pulling the dose for you, you don't know which specific black market drug to ask for. But also, even if they pressure their doctors, the doctors just can only give them something like palliative care or something weaker like penicillin, which doesn't have as high a resistance coefficient. Which is why even if there are incentives to keep pressuring, it doesn't actually matter, because the means to access it are already stripped away on our side of the house. Second of all, in terms of why we actually think this is, second of all, in terms of the backlash, so again, you can just cross-apply the arguments about why the WHO already has so much goodwill cultivated with developed and developing countries, as well as a massive, a ton of the ability to access economies of scale that individual countries can't, which means that they actually have the ability to implement and crush that backlash. With that said, though, I want to talk about what we think the bulk of the debate is, which is largely not just about individual cases of people finishing drug courses, because that is just a drop in the bucket of what actually causes the overwhelming tide of resistance, which is the massive abuse of things like of antibiotics in agricultural farming, right? Because that just affects more individual animals. On our side of the house, we think demand for food is inelastic, so if the costs go up for the beef industry, they can just pass it on to the consumers, so profits stay the same, which is the reason why they won't lobby nearly as hard as op says. Furthermore, though, we think on our side of the House, only are we able to uniquely encourage economies to diversify the types of crops they invest in, because they can't just bank on the assumption that there's going to be resistance, right? When there are high risks associated with putting all your eggs in one basket, that's how you actually get the diversification, that long-run solve for the famine that they talk about. All these reasons, Crouchy propose.
I would like to answer that too, and I'd like to have your comments. And you can raise a hand.
Two issues in this speech. Will this ban be effective at stopping the rise of antibiotic resistance in these countries? Secondly, even if you are able to have some level of regulation, is it better or is it not better when you have backlash against the World Health Organization, who can do so much good in other external areas that are much more impactful in this debate? First of all, on whether or not you're still going to be able to access it. Open governments say people are willing to comply because if you unify the populace on their health, there are economic incentives and you level non-state actors from acting. Firstly, I would note that economic incentives are symmetric on both sides because, as OO already said in their counterprop, they're willing to have all these soft policies as well. We're going to tell you later why those soft policies are more likely to work when you don't have proof of backlash. But crucially, when they talk about non-state actors, they already miss a huge part of the thing that they have to fulfill on government bench. And it's to say why members of the World Health Organization will listen to this ban. We told you there's an increasing trend of countries like the United States not listening to international norms, especially when they have huge internal agricultural lobbies and huge incentives to keep selling it, so they get more money for the country. There's also a collective action problem here, right? Because the first country to listen to this means they lose market share in the country they're selling to, so other countries will now sell to that country. So as soon as the US stops listening to the WHO, you have other countries also not listening. The response actually comes from Fiji when they say, but the WHO has lots of benefits that people don't want to miss out on. First of all, we told you already in Kesha's speech, no thank you, that they're unlikely to kick out the United States because they're their primary source of funding. They also grant a lot of legitimacy to the organization, which is why they have power. So sure, maybe they can threaten sanctions. They're never actually going to be able to enforce these sanctions against states like the United States and the other states that follow because they see the United States flagrantly violating this. That's why they're unlikely to kick them out. But secondly, even if they kick out places like the United States, we then think they have even less ability to control this problem because the point at which you kick them out, the United States has no incentive to listen to anything the WHO says. They don't have no incentive to listen to anything they do. So they're likely to lose legitimacy in that instance, which is why they're not going to do it. So we told you, some countries will exist that are under the WHO that will always be selling to this. That is why, even if they say developing countries have an incentive to stay in the WHO, all the reasons go away when other countries are still selling to them. Why? If they lose access to the research of the WHO, which they acknowledge primarily comes from the US, and the US is still selling, they're able to access these benefits anyway. But also, I highly doubt the WHO is not going to intervene in the instance of crises. So, like, their sanctions they're talking about aren't going to work, because the WHO is going to intervene in countries with crises, even if they're not members, because that's the whole mandate of the organization. No, thank you. But secondly, even if you don't buy that, we said countries who are not currently in the WHO will sell drugs to these countries. What does this mean? Currently, the WHO already has regulations on how these drugs are produced in the first instance, not just selling. That means countries who are not currently under the WHO will be willing to sell drugs to these countries that aren't as regulated. So even if you have the same amount of drugs on either side, the drugs they're getting are worse on their side because they're coming from countries who are not under the mandate of even the regulation of producing that drugs. That is why we think we take that debate. No, thank you. So then we have to compare what is the incentive to access from these countries rather than just complying to the WTO. Because they say, the WHO, sorry. They say countries have an incentive to stay in the WHO. Here's the problem. Even if they're an incentive to stay in the WHO, they can get all the same benefits from places like the United States, and in the very worst instances of public health crises, the WHO will intervene anyway because that is their mandate. Secondly, we told you, no thank you, there are strong internal lobbies from pharmaceutical companies within that country, as well as agricultural lobbies like in Argentina that Kesha told you, that want them to do this. But even if you don't buy all those incentives, there's a fundamental feasibility problem here, in that it is very difficult for governments to direct their doctors to do this. It is fundamentally very difficult for them to tell their doctors and their patients and everyone else who have relied on this for so long and it's a norm in the country to have this available to you at all times to not do this. That is why it's incredibly difficult for them to solve the problem of solve this problem, because people are still going to get these drugs anyway, both from countries who are in the WHO who are likely to flagrantly not listen, as well as countries who are not in the WHO. There's an incentive for the countries they're selling to get this because all the benefits they describe are symmetric. Opening.
In our world, procuring these drugs is illegal and much harder. Coupled with our cost savings, we make the use of broad-spectrum antibiotics the practical option to do. We give you the strongest case for non-state actor compliance.
So it doesn't matter if something is harder if it doesn't reach the threshold of hard enough in order to stop it from happening. So it doesn't matter if you make some action harder if that action is still going to happen on either side. So that doesn't actually deal with our case, because we told you why countries like the US are still going to do it, or even if it's not countries like the US, countries who are external to the WHO, who have incentives to get power in this country, like countries who are not in the WHO will sell their drugs, they will provide all these other incentives to do so. So I think we fundamentally proved to you why there are incentives for countries within the WHO to keep selling, countries who are receiving it to keep buying from these instances without changing the way they want to use them, because it's so ingrained in the culture. The agricultural lobby keeps wanting to use it this way, and there are some fundamental other ways to do it. But even if you have some level of regulation, why is the backlash one of the most important things in this debate? I'm going to give you a lot of reasons why there's going to be backlash against the WHO that didn't get engaged with. Firstly, it's seen as a magic fix in this country, and it's seen as the Western organization going against it. But secondly, there's strong internal pressures from lobbies and companies who are able to wage a propaganda war against the WHO to convince the government to keep using their medicines, as well as other countries who offer to sell it to you anyway, which increasingly undercuts the legitimacy of the WHO. We think this is incredibly important that they did not engage with, because let's give them their best case scenario. Let's say you stop the overuse of these drugs. There are still other ways that antibiotic resistance and other public health crises form. We gave you an POI from Keshav's speech about people not using the full dose of that medicine. That's incredibly important, because one of the biggest ways antibiotic resistance forms is when you don't go through the full dose of that medicine and people stop using it immediately as soon as they feel better. That allows the drug to form antibiotic resistance. The reason this is extremely harmful is that even if you accept their best case scenario, no thank you, and then people start getting access to high resistant drugs again, if they don't trust the WHO, and if they don't trust the education they're trying to give to these countries to use these drugs responsibly, again, no thank you, or the reforms they're trying to play, you're likely to get antibiotic resistance forming anyway, no thank you. But crucially, in the status quo, companies have an incentive to control the level of antibiotic resistance that forms. They have an incentive to control the amount they release onto the country. Why? They gave you the reason themselves. It is very expensive to research these drugs, which is going to happen by states anyway. If it is very expensive to research your drugs, you have no incentive to make your drug completely ineffective, because that destroys your entire source of profit. So there are internal incentives already to do this. No thank you. We think, therefore, that means even if there's some level of resistance on both sides, companies have an incentive to minimize that resistance and sell responsibly, and people are likely to listen to WHO regulations. Doctors are likely to listen to the WHO. People taking this medicine are likely to listen to the WHO, such that it doesn't form. But even irrespective of antibiotic resistance, right, there's lots of other things that the World Health Organization does. Things like telling you about sanitation policy, things like doing things about urban planning, such that you prevent the breeding grounds for other diseases. The point at which you create an immense mistrust in the World Health Organization, you have that immense mistrust in any policies they suggest to you, or anything else they want to enact in your country. The point at which that is true, if these countries don't ignore all of that, even taking them at their best case, even though they never prove efficacy, you are likely to get you are likely to get worse public health crises happening. At the end of close opposition, we gave you reasons there will still be incentives to both sell and buy from these countries, because there are such strong pressures both within the countries selling and within the countries buying. We told you even if you have some level of efficacy on this specific policy, it makes it harder to fight antibiotic resistance overall and other crises, while there are incentives from the WHO and there are incentives from companies themselves to fight these problems. For those reasons, see you.
I would like to thank my speaker.